Creating accounts in Windows NT. There's two accounts that come with Windows NT, Administrator and Guest. By default, Guest is disabled, and by default, Administrator is a member of the local administrators group, which means it has all the rights and permissions of an administrator of that particular computer or domain. Now, with the Guest account, that's disabled by default, and I don't recommend enabling it even if you have a guest that needs access to your network. What I would do is create another account that no one knows the name of, tell the guest that account name, let him come in as that account. Now with the administrator account, you need to protect that because it does have the rights and privileges of an administrator. So there's two things you want to do. Number one, give it a nice, strong password, maybe 8 characters, numbers, letters, special characters. And number two, you want to rename it. Now renaming the administrator account does two things. Number one, it makes it a name that nobody knows, so it's a little harder for them to try to hack in using that account. Number two, it makes it subject to the account lockout policy. Now you've set an account policy on your domain of after 3 or 4 bad logon attempts, lock that account up. That's great, it keeps hackers out. But the administrator account is immune to that. Once you rename the administrator account, then it is subject to that account lockout policy. Okay, so what tool do we use to create a user account, and where is that user account actually created? Let's start small and talk about an NT workstation. Now, an NT workstation, when we create the account, it's going to be using the user manager tool. So, here's our NT workstation. And it's got a directory services database, also known as a SAM, or a security accounts manager database, where all users are created. Every NT machine has a directory services database. So I use my user manager tool, and I create an account called Bob. Now, that account is created on an NT workstation, which means that you have to actually be at that NT workstation to log in as Bob. It's a local account on that local database. Now, the place to create a domain account so that no matter where you are within the domain, you can log in as that user would be on the primary domain controller. Primary domain controller has a directory services database. It's a NT computer configured as a PDC, or a primary domain controller. Now, the special thing about the directory services database on the PDC is that it's shared for the entire domain, so anyone can log in who's a member of that domain and be authenticated. And you can also configure one or more backup domain controllers that will receive automatically from the PDC the directory services database. So what we have is a read-write version of the domain directory services database on the PDC and a read-only version on all configured BDCs. So when a change is made to the directory services database for the domain, when a user is added or a password is changed, that change happens on the read-write copy of that directory services database on the PDC. So does that mean that we have to actually sit at the PDC to create a user account for the domain? No. All we have to do is make sure that we're using the appropriate tool. The appropriate tool is User Manager for Domains. If we're using User Manager for Domains, the focus will automatically be set to the directory services database of the PDC. So, we've got a local account that we created on an NT workstation. Let's create a domain account on the PDC, and we'll call it Bob S. Alright, so let's run through a real quick scenario of how to use these two user accounts that we've created. Now, we're going to be sitting at this NT workstation for both scenarios. So I walk up to the NT workstation, I sit down, I hit Control-Alt-Delete, I click on my drop-down box to choose the domain, and I see two things on the list. I see the name of my computer, NTW, and I see the name of the domain. Now, if I select the computer as my authentication source, then the only option I have is to log in as Bob, the local account. I'm logging into this NT Workstation, logging into this computer. If I select the domain as my authentication source, then my choice becomes any account created in the domain directory services database. In our case, Bob S. So we covered what accounts come with NT. We covered the tools you use to create a user account, User Manager if it's a local account, User Manager for domains if it's a domain account. And then we ran through a little scenario of how to log into an NT Workstation or a domain as far as selecting your authentication source. Let's run through the on-screen demonstration now and see the actual creation of a user account.